Here's a view of the motherboard. I had to disconnect the keyboard, the internal disk drive, the audio speaker and the clock. Let's talk a little bit about the memory board. The very first version of the Apple III had a 12 volt memory board, and it's quite different to what I have. I have the 5 volt memory board. They changed it because of a reliability issue. There is a rumor that a technician already figured out that the connectors which were used to connect the motherboard to the memory board were faulty. They had no good connection. So he figured out if he just slams the computer on the table, this would reseat the memory board and the computer would work again. This led to this infamous quote, lift 3 inches and drop. That was on the very early Apple IIIs. Again, this is contributing to the bad reputation of Apple III, but all Apple IIIs after that with a 5 volt board don't have this problem. The connectors were redesigned, the board works much better. The only thing I have to complain about the board is this huge power resistor, this white thing you can see there. This is creating a lot of heat. This is, I would say, beside the power supply, the main heat source inside the computer. And that's why I have opted to put in a fan, which only provides air to this resistor and tries to cool it. My Apple III was a 128K version, but you can see all the sockets on the memory board are filled up. So one of the previous owners took out the money and purchased memory, which was really expensive back then, and maxed it out to 256 kilobytes, which is the current status of the machine. There were aftermarket memory boards available, which could boost the Apple III to 512 kilobytes. They required a little bit more work. You had to replace the memory board and then also do some really fancy stuff with some chips on the motherboard to make the 512 kilobyte working. Another nice story about the Apple III is that it could emulate the Apple II, but really the base Apple II 48 kilobyte version. Now, what is so special on it is the Apple III works with the same processor than the Apple II. But when you emulate the Apple II, you have even increased speed. Nowadays, we do software emulation. Our computers are fast enough. They just emulate things like an Apple II in no time, and you have no speed penalty. Back then, that wasn't possible. So to avoid that the Apple III would software emulate an Apple II, and then the Apple II software emulation would be incredibly slow, they actually did a hardware emulation. So there is extra hardware built in the Apple III to emulate the Apple II, to keep the Apple II emulation in a speed which is comparable, if not even better, than the Apple II. But we go there a little bit more in detail in the next part when we talk about software and the Apple II emulation mode. So here we have now the Apple power supply. One thing I want to mention is here that the Apple power supply looks like brand new. Why is this? Because, well, it is really hermetically isolated from the outside. no dust can get into the compartment of the power supply. You have seen on the motherboard there is some dust on it, and that's normal for a 40-year-old computer. But the power supply is pristine. Another thing which immediately pops up is the power supply is so small compared to the compartment they have made for the power supply. My explanation for this is that the aluminum casing was defined and designed very early in the design process of the Apple II, and probably they had a different power supply in mind. And then later they opted for the smaller power supply they have built in there. So there is a lot of empty room, not bad, but wouldn't have been necessary if they had planned for the power supply and the whole computer a little bit more. This is a profile card. This is interface card to the profile drive, and in my system it's in slot 1. As you can see, this is a very simple design. If you have ever seen a hard drive interface card for an IBM PC from the 1981s, you would appreciate how simple this design is. Early hard drive cards were a monster of a mini computer which you plugged into your main computer. Very complicated. But Apple had always the idea to make those things simple and put the workload on the software, meaning the processor, on not having too many external ICs on their cards. This is the modern addition I did to my Apple III. It's a compact flash hard drive, which is residing in the slot 4, gives me 3 profile drive spaces to store software. Well, that's my main external memory for the Apple III. This card was developed for the Apple II series, but thankfully they also wrote drivers for the Apple III. I got it to work. It is a fine addition. I don't want to miss it in my computer. This card is also capable of addressing an IDE hard drive. I have never used it because my compact flash storage is large enough and fast enough and reliable enough for me. I use also the compact flash to make backup copies of my profile drive. So I simply make a device copy. I copy the whole profile drive on my compact flash card. So in case my profile drive ever really gives up and gets out of commission, I have a backup of all the data on it. Here's another modification I did, and that's a very simple 12-volt fan I put into my Apple III, which provides some cooling to this power resistor I have mentioned before. It's not a biggie. It's extremely silent, you can't hear it. I guess if this would have been shown in 1982 with Steve Jobs, he would have agreed that that is acceptable to put into the Apple III. So let us compare the Disk 2 drive from the Apple II to the Disk 3 drive from the Apple III. They're very similar. Biggest difference between the two drives are the connectors. They are not interchangeable, but you can build an adapter so that you can plug in a Disk 2 to an Apple III. However, you lose the daisy chain capabilities, which is something we got used to on the later Apple IIs. And I think that was also taken from the Apple III project to chain up disk drives So here I removed the covers and you can see already very similar. The circuit boards are very similar, except you can see on the Apple III drive in the back there's some kind of extension, and that is the daisy chainable option. So there you plug in the next drive and the next drive so that you can have in total 4 drives in series. On an Apple II that is not possible. You have one drive interface card and you can plug in 2 drives which you have to plug into the interface card, and that's it. On the Apple III with the daisy chain capability you can get them in a chain and have up to 4 drives. I think that is a good example of the forward thinking they have done in this project, and also something where you can really see that the following generations of Apple computers, even if the Apple III was a commercial failure, I think a lot of things which were developed for the Apple III have been then put forward into the new computers, and an Apple IIgs, an Apple IIe, Apple IIc, they all benefited from the development of the Apple III. So this ends the Apple III hardware section, and yes, I could do a much deeper dive, but it would take hours and hours to go over everything. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see some more deep dive into the hardware, and I will be happy to put out another video about the Apple III. And don't forget to get to the next series where we talk about the software of the Apple III. Thank you.